to the webinar, and then we'll get started in just a moment. As we wait, you can use the chat function to enter your name and where you're joining us from. It's always nice to see who else is in the room and who's with us today. Thank you all for being here. So again, welcome to today's webinar. This was a preservation of practice seminar hosted by Historic Hawaii Foundation with several partners. Today we'll be talking about standards and guidelines for flood adaptation for historic buildings. Historic Hawaii Foundation is a statewide nonprofit organization that helps people save historic places. I'm Kirsten Faulkner. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Hawaii, and I'm also joined today by Andrea Nandeskar and Michelle Kizik, part of our education programming team. We're really excited to be offering today's webinar. It is being live streamed through YouTube and Facebook, and the recording will be available afterwards. We will also be posting the slideshow and presentation materials to historichawaii.org, so you'll be able to download and refer to those later on. That may free you up from taking frantic notes. This is part of a series of technical preservation trainings that we've been doing with National Park Service for a couple of years now. And the past trainings are also available on our website. We'll be talking about flood adaptation standards today, but we'll also be referring back to the General Secretary of Interior standards and guidelines for historic properties. And we did a webinar on that about a year ago. So if you want to learn more about those basic guidelines and standards, that training is also available. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo, who is our partner from the National Park Service. Mahalo, Dr. Jackson-Rotondo.
Aloha, I'm Elaine Jackson-Rotondo, the Preservation Partnerships and History Programs Manager for the National Park Service region that includes Hawaii. We are pleased to be a co-sponsor of the Hawaii Preservation in Practice series. And today I'm welcoming two colleagues who will be our featured speakers for today's presentation. Ms. Jennifer Eggleston is the Chief of Staff for the National Park Service Office of the Associate Director for Cultural Resources. She is one of the primary team members responsible for guidance and training regarding adapting historic buildings to the threat of flooding. Ms. Eggleston co-authored the recently released Guidelines in Flood Adaptation for Rehabilitating Historic Buildings. Prior to serving as Chief of Staff, Ms. Eggleston served as the primary grants manager for the Hurricane Katrina and Rita Historic Preservation Recovery Grant Program. We are also joined by Ms. Jenny Parker, who is an architectural historian in the Technical Preservation Services Office of the National Park Service, where she produces guidance materials and presentations related to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. Ms. Parker is one of the other co-authors of the guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. She also is responsible for review of federal historic tax credits projects. We are also pleased to welcome Dr. Carl Kim, who will be presenting our case study. Dr. Kim is a professor in the Urban and Regional Planning Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He leads the graduate program on disaster management and humanitarian assistance and is the executive director of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center at UH-Mānoa. This seminar has been approved by the American Planning Association for certificate maintenance credits for AICP through the co-sponsorship and partnership with APA Hawaii chapter. We thank APA Hawaii for supporting continuing education for planning professionals. This seminar also has been approved by the American Institute of Architects for 1.5 AIA CES HSW credits. Architects seeking credit will need to enter their name and AIA number in the post-event survey that will come up on a separate webpage after the webinar ends. Now a bit about the course. This training provides an overview on the guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. The National Park Service issued the guidelines in 2019 in response to a request for technical preservation guidance specific to historic properties at risk for flooding. The goal of the guidelines on flood adaptation is to provide information about how to adapt historic buildings to be more resilient to flooding risk in a manner that will preserve their historic character and that will meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. A case study will present a methodology and evaluation example for the Charlot House, a historic building in Kāhala, Oahu. The School of Architecture's Community Design Center and the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at UH-Mānoa are applying the guidelines to prepare a disaster preparation plan for the property. Today's seminar will be about 90 minutes. The first portion is a presentation about the general concepts, followed by a case study, then audience questions. We have a full agenda, as you can see. We will try to leave time after the presentations for questions, but we'll also use the chat function as we go. Please send your questions to Andrea and the panelists. Andrea will monitor the chat and direct questions to our presenters. We will try to answer when they are not actively presenting. And now I turn the presentation over to Jennifer Eggleston and Jenny Parker.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction, and we are both looking very much forward to having this conversation with you guys today. Won't repeat who we are, you just heard all about us, but we hope that everyone had an opportunity to maybe review the actual guidelines document in its full length prior to this, because what we're going to really do here is kind of a high-level review with the concepts inside of that document. So with that, we'll kind of move right on in. So Jenny, next slide, please. So just for context and looking at getting to eyeball a little bit of who's joining us today, I think many of you know this, so sorry to repeat concepts you probably are pretty familiar with, but it's important to kind of understand where we sit in the framework. You know, why is the Park Service involved in this topic? And Elaine gave you a little bit of context there, but it's a roles and responsibility that has a huge federal, state, and local nexus. So there's lots of entities like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the National Flood Insurance Program, that are naturally connected to those state emergency management agencies, as well as local ordinances and how flooding is actually managed. Where we step in is that we are the National Park Service is responsible for kind of the national preservation programs of the country. And we're responsible for providing technical assistance to property owners. So this is really where our connection and our space kind of connects in with this larger audience in the federal, state, and local kind of disaster risk management world. Next issue, or next slide, sorry. Giving away the title of the slide. So just a little more context about the guidelines themselves and why did we arrive here and kind of the considerations we've been working through. So full disclosure, the guidelines are really focused on buildings, historic buildings and historic structures. And that's a combination of reasons why it is. One of them is that the authors, who are the folks talking today, are much more connected to historic sites and structures in our backgrounds and our disciplines. So kind of our expertise. And then also we listen to our state and local partners, and that is where they were largely asking for some of the most immediate assistance and immediate guidance. And that's because of the three pieces here identified on the slide. So we don't ignore archaeology and landscapes. They're tangentially spoken about or connected to in some of the treatments inside of the document. And the process we outline is sound for those resource types, but we have a heavy, again, focus on buildings and structures. One reason was, again, why are partners coming to us saying, help us with this particular issue? One was just everything we know, the increase of the natural threats and the trends and the pressure that is really kind of ramping up for a whole host of reasons on historic property, things like sea level rise and increased rainfalls and increased intensity events. So it's something that our partners were really saying, we need immediate assistance, better assistance in this arena. The very important economic stress that some of the resources were under. So the idea of significant rate increases to flood insurance. So the historic rates, or those past rates that property owners were seeing for flood insurance, were exponentially increasing to the point that they needed more solutions and more flexibility, and were coming to us and saying, can we dig in on this issue, including the idea of real estate value, the threat to not only the cost to the property owner, but also what is this property really going to be worth? And we're even seeing communities having to plan on mortgage cycles in many ways, thinking about how long will this real estate be here? How long will they have a tax base? And then there is a real and important political threat. So, communities are having to make very important decisions about life and property and reducing those costs and stressors to their community around the topic of flooding. And so all of those three very key pieces kind of presented themselves to us. And we recognized at the Park Service that it wasn't business as usual. We needed to be kind of more open and flexible in our thinking, because you don't get to consult with Mother Nature. It's not the same kinds of threats or challenges we've dealt with preservation. And so that's really how we arrived at this effort. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny for a moment.
Thanks, Jen. And in continuing to frame today's discussion, as a reminder, we're coming at the problem of flooding from a preservation lens. So how is it that you measure success when we're talking about preservation? And it really comes down to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. And as was mentioned previously, there is an entire 1 hour or maybe 90-minute session that is available through the link that was posted on the chat earlier by Kirsten or Andrea, one of the two, from a previous webinar. But in brief, and as a reminder for those of you who might not be as familiar, within the treatment standards, there are 4 different treatments. One is preservation, and that means to basically stabilize and repair a property without any significant alterations. There's restoration, which will return a property to a significant date in time and basically freeze it in time. Reconstruction will allow you to rebuild a structure based on either remaining physical evidence or some sort of documentation like drawings or photographs. And then there's rehabilitation, which allows you to adapt and update buildings for modern use while keeping their historic character. And all of these treatments apply to both the interior and the exterior of the buildings. Rehabilitation is the most commonly used, and the flood guidelines that we're going to be talking about are based really solely on the rehabilitation treatment. So we're really talking about adapting buildings and updating them for modern use. The way that the guidelines fit into kind of our hierarchy of publications and guidance is there in the middle of this sort of pyramid. The Secretary of the Interior standards really set the rules for preservation. They're aimed at the sort of 10,000 foot level. And then the guidelines tier off of that. They will interpret the standards and kind of bring things down to the equivalent of a bird's eye level. And then we have additional publications that tier off of the guidelines. You may be familiar, you may not. They are preservation briefs, interpreting the standards bulletins, and preservation tech notes. And those really come in at the project level or focus on specific building features or materials. And all of these publications work together to provide guidance for meeting the standards. Now, today we are going to be talking about guidelines specifically, and those have a specific structure. Hopefully you've had a chance to at least briefly open the flood guidelines and see what they look like. And you will have noticed that the flood guidelines, as well as all of other types of guidelines, are set out in a format that offers recommended and not recommended treatments.
And we have sort of our own language for the guidelines. We consistently use active verbs that end in ing. So if you're not familiar with that particular language, it could throw you off to get started, but it's a standard format. Jen?
Thanks. So just to kind of start working our way into the guidelines document, first we wanted to just talk a little bit about kind of what the guidelines are and a little bit more information on them. So first, just what we want to bring to your attention, this feels like a unique set, right? It's kind of geared at a set topic, flooding. It's not actually the first time the Park Service has put out guidelines on a set topic or an issue or stressor. They did resiliency guidelines. And we know we need to keep building the suite of material too. We realize this is not the end all be all, that it itself needs to keep moving, and we need to keep thinking about topics that maybe need a similar kind of support. The organization is that we have a very inclusive list of adaptation treatments, and inside of each of those adaptations, we really talk about what that description is, what is this treatment, high-level preservation concerns, and then some of the technical challenges with picking that treatment depending on what is the properties assembly or materials. And again, what Jenny talked about, that recommended, not recommended structure, which really walks you through the application of a treatment. One thing that we ourselves as a team struggled with at times was it's not in any sort of order. So sometimes I think people see it as a list from top to bottom of most severity, least severity. It's not. It really is dependent on the site about what could be, an acceptable or okay treatment at one location is maybe not going to work for the other location, again, for all those unique dependent circumstances. And again, more flexibility inside of these guidelines. You're going to see things that are not necessarily going to be appropriate in most circumstances because we're trying to address that risk associated with flooding, again, with respect to trying to preserve that character of historic property as much as we can. And then a concept you'll probably hear Jenny and myself echo a few times is you got to read the intro. It's people want to kind of jump straight into adaptations because that's, what we're trying to think about. What am I going to do here at my site? Really important to read that intro to understand that critical information to lead into it, to what I need to do. Now you can go, Jenny. So applying the guidelines, you've got to, even though we're allowing more flexibility, a lot more change, it's got to be a documented risk. It's got to be empirical evidence of the risk. So, a concern of flooding isn't necessarily going to lead you into these guidelines. You've got to understand what your particular, I'm sorry, am I getting feedback or is that something? It might be me. I'll try to not move as much. Sorry.
You are.
Okay. Understand the risk itself, the type of flooding. Is it a flash flood? Are we talking about surface flooding, riverine flooding, coastal flooding? So understanding exactly what are the characteristics of your flooding. Got to know your property too. What is the condition of my property? What's the site and location of my property? How does that actually work within that whole consideration? And again, different alternative treatments are going to be in this document that you're not going to see in other guidelines or in other circumstances because we're trying to be flexible and letting that risk be a primary concern and understanding. Next slide, Jenny. Jargon. There's a lot of jargon in this document. We tried to do our best to find those plain language, plain English, narrative as much as we could, but it's the government. What would the government be without our jargon? So you're going to see a lot of terms that are both terms of art for our friends in the Federal Emergency Management Agency. You're going to see things that are preservation terms. We have our own language that we like historic character, character defining integrity, things we all love, but don't necessarily all have the clearest definition. I think one of the things we always want to make sure, just because these are a lot of things pulling together, a lot of new information or new terms at times, that everybody involved understands what they're talking about. So we always try to kind of stop and emphasize that these terms need to be understood by the group. working on the issue. And then one of the key pullouts here is that you're going to see a brand new term. You know, what would it be if we didn't invent our own term, called established flood risk. And the most important thing, and that's really a stand-in to say the risk at flooding at that particular site. The reason we opted to kind of create a new term was to avoid confusion that we were defining another agency's definition or their actual regulatory language. We don't want to get in anyone's lane and say, oh, the National Park Service just told me I'm going to meet my base flood elevation by doing this. We want to be very respectful and clear that we're trying to provide advice about the risk without necessarily meeting another agency's statutory definition. So, okay, the next slide. Thank you, Jenny. We're going to kind of ease you now into the planning process in the document. And that's going to be the large focus here right now that Jenny and myself are going to walk you guys through. So these are all the steps. It's a process, right? The steps you're going to have to think through before you even arrive at the adaptation door and say, I think I might need to do something now. And planning happens no matter what. So it's the key first step, no matter what you're going to end up necessarily doing. And we always like to say, and it might be enough. It might be once you've really kind of dug in and studied the conditions, the flooding, the issue, might be all you need to do right now. You might need to monitor and come back. So not everything's going to result in a physical treatment adaptation. I know we sometimes jump to, oh, I've got to elevate, or I've got to, immediately do something here. And the reality is maybe I don't need to go there right now. So really what we're doing here is getting ready to walk you through these steps. And one of the things that we'll emphasize throughout is that we all are, many of us have been in planning processes. Many of us are planners by training. Many of us get into long and involved thought exercises. We really want people to close that loop and make a decision. Don't just default into continued study, because as some of our slides will show, sometimes you don't have time, and sometimes we need to actually reach more of an active, defined decision than just saying, oh, I'm continuing to study. So I think while we want that considered, thought process, we also want you to reach an active, defined decision point. Okay, so our first kind of key there that was at the top of that chart we just showed is really about the risk, right? So we need to figure out what is it that I need to consider about this property that maybe I haven't had to before, or is now amping up in a certain way. We've got a whole host here of natural threats that could be at a site. We're obviously talking about flooding, but we don't ever want to have folks ignore the fact that all sites have multifaceted risk, and we should be thinking about those other pieces as much as we can, and integrating that into our thinking as much as we can. So it's really important to know what those high level, if you will, stressors are at that particular location, or for your community, or for what you're studying. And I think folks probably know, a few of you guys know this, a good place to even point to is to go look at a local hazard mitigation plan, or even a statewide hazard mitigation plan, which really are the planning documents that FEMA has that framework to really help communities and states sort of identify what are those risks, those major disaster risks for a community, coupled with, and what are we going to probably do about some of that in the long term. And there's an important nexus with federal funding that comes with those hazard mitigation plans, but it's just a good tool to kind of say, there's a place to even just look to some of that material to find, again, that higher level risk. And then the next slide is, then there's the site specific vulnerabilities and risk and exposure that we want folks to really look at in this planning process. So you've got to think about high level risk, but what does that actually mean when we're talking about my site, my specific location? So back to that, understanding the site, the setting, the type of flooding, what are the pieces of exposed or less exposed parts of my resource. So in flooding, obviously our foundation, our lower sections of our building are generally most at risk, but are there other things I need to be thinking about as I look at a site like this? Do I have exposure to storm surge and high winds? And is there any sort of wave action that maybe comes with flooding? I need to be thinking about what inherent exposure is happening right here at the site, but I also need to know what about that site already has some existing capacity or resiliency built into it. So it's not all doom and gloom. Sometimes the way something was sited, the materials it was built out of, The kind of construction techniques and landscape features and placement all actually lend themselves to help reduce or kind of address some of that risk already. And one of the things you'll see throughout the guidelines is we really did try to emphasize that idea of understanding that regional and historic context, not only because we value that, but because oftentimes people knew how to build for the climate that they lived in. So, you know, pier construction foundations are often very common in heat and humidity environments because of airflow. Well, they're also helpful in moving water through a site. So we talk a little bit about that, like understanding that resource and what kind of inherent resiliency is present there, and taking that into serious account and understanding that regional tradition. So thank you. Next slide. And then there is the really important kind of, it's a step on the flow chart, but it's not really a step. It's kind of a keep it moving, keep it happening, always have it present in anything that you're doing. Even once you've decided to adapt and do an adaptation, you're still always going to be kind of in a monitoring condition, reevaluating posture. So sorry, it's not a step you get to like check off the list and say, oh, I've monitored and I'm done. It's really a continuous cycle, just like maintenance is. Like we never really get out of that once we're stewarding a site or we own a site. And in particular with climate change, the conditions in which the buildings or the sites were originally constructed are changing, the stressors are changing, and some of the exposure and rates of things are changing. So it's really important to have a monitoring process in place, a reevaluation process in place. And again, everything has a time horizon. No matter what we do, we never completely outrun what is ultimately going to happen. And so it is really, this step is so key. And again, it's continuous. So with that, we'll go back over to Jenny for a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. So the next step in this kind of planning process is documentation, which is of course a very important part of every preservation related project. So it should feel familiar to those of you in the audience who come from the preservation background. And documentation can take many forms, from a basic, description and sketches to detailed photographs, all the way up to very sophisticated laser scanning. And this documentation takes place at varying scales, from an individual piece of a building to a large landscape. And on the screen, you see a photograph of the Ma'alea General Store. My apologies if I mispronounced that. You'll also see an old site map for that particular location that dates from 1934 that shows the building's position very close to the coast and immediately next to a creek, which actually no longer exists. If you look at current satellites or maps, you'll see that the creek is no longer visible. But it's important to know that it was once there from planning for a flood adaptation, because water has memory. It's not unusual for flooding to reoccur at these kind of underground creek locations. So the appropriate level of documentation will be dependent on the purpose. So you may need more documentation before you actually enter the construction phase. And when we're talking about flood adaptation specifically, you'll need to expand your scope from kind of our typical preservation perspective to include some more relevant site characteristics. Elevations are very important to know when we're considering any type of flood adaptation. So you'll need to know what height the ground floor level is, what level is the lowest adjacent grade, or the lowest window or door opening in the building. You'll also need to know kind of what your surrounding topography looks like. Groundwater level is changing, so you might want to document where that particularly falls within your site, below the soils. And with all of that, you might need to engage with different professionals than we're used to, somebody like a survey team. So first, you want to ensure that you have a baseline documentation, and as you get further into the planning process and start to identify the adaptation, you might need to circle back and add to your documentation before you actually begin construction.
Next, we want to ensure that we have reviewed and understand all of the applicable codes and regulations. These projects did not occur in a vacuum, so you'll need to find the local flood ordinance and the local regulations that apply to a specific property. You want to understand the flood insurance factor as well. So do you have or need flood insurance for that property? And what impact would any adaptations have on the insurance premiums? On the screen, you see the FEMA flood map for the general store, showing that the property is located in a special flood hazard area, which is noted by the orange shading. And if you happen to access this map from the local municipality, in this case, Maui County, you're going to learn some additional details. For example, the property is in a tsunami evacuation zone, and you'll also find links there to the local floodplain requirements. So your local jurisdiction is a really good place to start. After you've sort of gone through this process, rather involved but necessary, to identify the risks and the property conditions and begin your documentation, then you can really move into a problem-solving focus. The flood guidelines are intended to provide an overview of the range of adaptation treatments that are available and provide the pros and cons from the preservation perspective. And we're going to go over kind of some of what those treatments include a little bit later in the presentation. But for the purposes of planning, it's important to know that using this document in combination with various publications from FEMA, you should be able to start to focus in on options that might be feasible for adding resiliency to any of your historic properties. And as you start to focus in on some of those specific treatments, you'll need to apply some assessment criteria to determine which one has the best possibility for a given location. And as you're trying to decide what does best mean, for these cases, we, in that Venn diagram you see on the screen, have identified this sort of balancing act that you need to keep in mind between three major factors. First, you need to reduce flood risk while also maintaining the historic character of the place, and the adaptation needs to be feasible and affordable to implement and maintain. As you assess each of these options, you can start to ask questions, and that'll really help identify what makes a lot of sense going forward. Of course, you want to ask, will it sufficiently reduce the risk of damage if the flood event does occur? Jen has mentioned the time horizon previously. You know, how far into the future are you trying to gain protection for a site? We know that the seas around Hawaii have already risen 10 inches since 1950. So we know that conditions are changing, and as you move forward in time, the risk may also change. So selecting the time frame for your adaptation might be dependent on something like the length of time you plan to own or manage the property, or perhaps the lifespan of the materials or systems that would need to be included in that specific adaptation. Next, you'll need to apply the Secretary's standards and analyze the impacts of the treatments to the property with the historic preservation lens. So will the historic character of the property be maintained? Can a treatment be implemented without any visible changes? If so, from a preservation perspective, that's probably a very positive thing. And if visible alterations are necessary, is it possible to match the appearance of anything that you're changing? And if the appearance can't be matched, is there a compatible solution? Next, you'll need to consider any viable treatments in the context of the neighborhood or the community. Are there local traditions that could address the threat sufficiently? And would that help to reduce the risk? You will want to explore whether or not the local jurisdiction is planning any kind of community-wide interventions that might protect the property. So maybe you can avoid doing something specifically on your site where it might change the conditions. You'll also want to know how local authorities are responding to the threat and explore whether or not there's a point in the future when occupying that site won't be viable any longer or won't be supported by local infrastructure, particularly when we're talking about sea level rise. Once you've made those assessments, you should be really honing in on a specific treatment plan. We do want to emphasize that it's really important to actually make the treatment decision. Jen mentioned this before, but we don't want to get bogged down in studying the problem. Study and thoughtful process and planning is very important, but you do have to take action at a certain point, as long as action really is warranted and feasible. On the screen, you can see a perfect example of this situation. We have a historic church in Alaska that is precariously located next to an eroding bluff. And obviously the building really needs to be moved. The situation got to this point, became so dire because there was a rapid increase in the rate of erosion. The cost involved with this project of moving the building was very high for the community involved, and it's a very remote location. I am happy to report that this church was moved in August last year to a temporary location, and the community is still continuing to raise funds and search for a new permanent location for the building. So they've created sort of this two-step process to save the church building. We would hope that projects don't get to quite so close to the tipping point as this one reached. So again, it's really important to make a decision, even if that decision is that we need to continue monitoring. You need to make that a conscious decision, not a default. That's kind of this paralysis of studying the problem and feeling overwhelmed. It's very important to consult stakeholders and involve the community. And the key to consultation is to do it early and often. And it might take the form of a federal process like Section 106 or a state or local equivalent, which if you're not familiar with Section 106, it's a very preservation kind of process. You could have something less formal than that, that's simply a communication and engagement plan. And this whole process could begin much earlier in your whole planning process than the placement in this list might indicate. We have it here because it's important not to forget, but it really could start much earlier as you're trying to determine possible treatments. You'll also need to obtain any necessary approvals and permits, and implementation, usually requires some level of review and approval, maybe something as simple as the building permit or, local design and review for a historic district. But the key is it's really important to be prepared to communicate the factors and limitations that helped you lead to a particular treatment decision. Once you've made that decision, everyone's on board, then don't delay in actually implementing the adaptation treatment once it's selected. The best plan you have, if it sits on a shelf, it's not actually going to protect the resource. So it might actually take a lot of creativity and financial sacrifice to make the adaptation treatment happen. There's some possibility for a little bit of help through grants that could come from one of your traditional preservation sources or a disaster preparedness or sustainability focused organization or agency. And for income producing properties, a good tool might be the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program. Now, as a reminder, the treatment isn't always a construction project. It could be active monitoring, but that would require different resources, maybe at a different level, but it still requires future action and investment. And the final step in this process is that after you have actually implemented the plan, you'll need to evaluate it for the performance to the extent that you can. For those of you who may be familiar with LEED certified projects, this is a similar concept to the operations and maintenance strategy. So really you're trying to answer the question, does the finished project actually do what it was intended to do? On the screen, you see a photograph of a project in Wisconsin that chose dry flood proofing to protect a commercial building in the downtown area.
And within, I think it was the first year of completing their adaptation project, they had another flood event. And they were very happy to see that everything worked as they intended. The interior of the building stayed dry, and any of the human intervention needed to actually deploy some of those floodgates at the doorways happened very smoothly. Now, not all projects are going to be flood tested quite this quickly after a project is completed, and we really hope not, but there's still some things that you can do after the fact to ensure a successful project going forward. And that includes implementing a regular schedule to review and inspect the system. You'll also want to practice any parts of the plan that require human action, like deploying the flood shields at the doorways. And you'll also want to monitor the condition of any materials and features that may degrade or deteriorate over time. Jen?
Thanks, Jenny. So now we're going to do really high level, simple review of adaptation treatments. I know it's like a lot of build up to get to the actual physical treatment, but again, the intro and the planning process is so critical. So on screen is kind of the list, if you will, of all the adaptations that are inside of the guidelines document. It's pretty comprehensive. As you can see, it's a lot more than elevation. I think people tend to just get to elevation quickly in their mind. We know that was a big concern with partners, but it's important to know we've got a suite of options here. We're going to kind of go through 4 of them that we've grouped in a moment: the keep the water out, the let the water in, avoid, and then kind of an unconventional lens, really from a preservation perspective, recognizing there's a lot of information we could go into here. We're really excited to see the case study that's going to come after us that I think can dig in a little bit more into the actual adaptations. And again, wanted to show the Venn diagram because we keep this in our own brains when we go through those adaptations. The idea that we're constantly having to ask ourselves, I got to reduce my flood risk. I got to make sure I'm picking something feasible and affordable for the actual site, and that I'm trying to maintain that historic character. So with that, we're gonna jump straight in. And again, we're gonna kind of do 4 buckets here with you guys, if you will. So the first one is keep water out. Its name tells you what it is, right? We're trying to push the water off of the resource. And it's inside of our adaptation guidelines. There's really 3 places that this is the emphasis area for that. That's the temporary barriers. So those things that are like temporary flood walls and sandbags and removable fencing. So again, temporary, not long-term commitments or infrastructure. Permanent site changes, permanent site structure like flood walls and levees and dikes. And they can also be green solutions. So things trying to like build back in more barriers and like less hardscaped, but it's again, a permanent solution, something you don't lift up and move out once the flooding's done. And then there's the actual dry flood proofing. And that's more about the on-site building and structure specific waterproofing the building envelope. So again, we're going to kind of share just the preservation piece of these. So with temporary barriers, it's probably the least amount of preservation concern, and it's temporary. So you take it off the site, you're probably not going to cause a lot of long-term damage. You're probably not really having something that's going to touch or impact that historic resource. Of course, there could always be landscape and archaeological concerns. We're not trying to downplay those or ignore those in any way. But we do always try to say it's, well, not necessarily a preservation concern. It is because it could damage the resource. If you're a frequent flooding location or the time is a flash flooding kind of risk, this is not a good choice because you don't have time to put the system in place. And again, if it's happening a lot, you probably need something more permanent in the solution. The landscape level permanent site structures, from a preservation of historic structures and buildings, we would say probably pretty good. It tends to not alter those individual resources. We tend, the big infrastructure, we're kind of thinking cities behind a levee system kind of image. So maybe not individual resources being impacted the same way, but really important to understand that site and setting and landscape features and archaeological resources and cultural and religious features, all of which could be protected in a system like this, but they have to be thought about. We can't just really, especially in a large scale implementation, just look at our individual structure and building. And we do talk a little bit about this in the guidelines. And then something we it comes up a lot, not just in this one, but something that's important is don't just push the water somewhere else. I mean, the water goes somewhere. So this idea of folks can see play out in real life on inside a levee system, outside a levee system, considered thinking around where is that water going and the fact that we live in a system. It's not just that it evaporates and doesn't impact somebody. And then dry flood proofing. Again, it's that watertight seal on the exterior of the building, the foundation, and anything that's in that flood risk. It's generally gonna involve some alterations of historic spaces and features. Things like, how am I going to either permanently or temporarily block my windows, my doors, my openings? What kind of other types of alterations, either structural or building envelope level things that I'm going to have to do? And probably one of the biggest ones that preservationists go, oh no, is that they're going to have to temporarily or permanently seal that building because we can't let water in. So the idea that you're creating an impermeable layer that you could be trapping water even as you do that is really important. And one of the biggest things that we kind of pumped the brakes on inside of this section to say, you really have to research, properly apply, and monitor that material, because again, as the floods happen, as time goes by, that's going to deteriorate, it's going to cause impact to material, and it's something that from a preservation lens, really a lot of time and consideration needs to be given to. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny.
And to wrap up kind of our big buckets of adaptation treatments, the second one is the strategy to let water in. And it's important to note with this strategy that it will always require cleaning and drying out of the building. But it's possible to limit the impacts. You can limit inundation of occupied spaces by constructing an interior elevated platform or abandoning the lowest floor. And with this strategy, the preservation concerns are probably fairly obvious. Historic features and finishes will likely be damaged by flowing water moving through. So this is not recommended for buildings that have spaces below the established flood risk level that have high level integrity in features and finishes that aren't also flood damage resistant. So if you happen to have a building that was constructed originally with flood damage resistant materials, that is much more conducive to this particular strategy. Our next bucket is avoiding the flood altogether, to relocate the building. And we have that identified in two different ways, which might be arguable. The one strategy is pretty obvious, to move the building out of the expected flood area, just move it away to a different site. We also consider moving the building up on a new foundation or on pilings on a taller foundation to be moving it out of the floodway, so to elevate above it. And the preservation concerns with this related to elevation, changing the height or the foundation of a historic building is generally a pretty significant visible alteration. So that translates to a pretty big impact on the historic character and appearance of the property. And the more significant that change in height is for the foundation, the more problematic that it will be. For moving a structure away from its original site, that is something in preservation that's generally not recommended. So in any other circumstance, we would be strongly recommending against it. So for flooding impacts, it's really most appropriate when the site is expected to flood repeatedly or succumb to river or shoreline erosion, or if the site is subject to permanent inundation from sea level rise. And then our final category is titled Unconventional Adaptations. And we really say unconventional because these treatments are either not recognized by FEMA and the flood insurance program in the same way that other treatments are, or they might still be in the prototype phase for retrofitting. So one of these is amphibious design with a buoyant foundation that will allow the building to float. And on the screen, the top two renderings kind of demonstrate a house that has been retrofit with this type of system. On the left, in 99% of the time, it will look just like it did historically with a few minor visible changes. And then during a flood, it would of course float on top of the water. Some other people are exploring the use of hydraulic lift systems to lift a structure only when a flood is expected and set it back in place when it is not flooding. And then there are a number of large-scale treatments that involve innovation that use a complex engineered system or a network to protect a large area, or to reestablish natural systems like living shorelines. And that's what you see, an artist rendering there on the lower left that shows one possibility of what the South Shore of Honolulu could look like with a living shoreline. In terms of preservation concerns for these kind of treatments, there's not enough existing examples for us to draw conclusions. So any sort of concern from a preservation perspective will be highly dependent on the specifics of that particular project. And I did want to mention that we specifically included this chapter in the guidelines to help remind us all that creative thinking in this space is really encouraged, and we should all be open to new ideas and methods of solving this problem. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. We will be available to answer questions at the end and in the chat. And at this point in time, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Kim to demonstrate some of these principles through the case study. Thanks.
Hi, it's great to see you all. Thank you, Jen and Jenny, for an excellent presentation. Let me see. Can you see my opening slide okay? Well, it's great to see you all. And I think my case or our case that we're working on really follows nicely from the presentation that we just heard. We are focusing on the Charlot House. And I think what we're trying to do with this is to think about how we can retrofit and also protect this important asset. I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking our team. It's actually being led by Kathy Shar, who's the director of the University of Hawaii School of Architecture Community Design Center. And my co-investigator on this project is Wendy Meguro, who's also with the School of Architecture. I really want to acknowledge all the students and staff from our center that have really been doing all the heavy lifting in terms of pulling together much of this material that I want to go through quickly. What I want to do is talk about the challenges of historic preservation and climate adaptation, and then demonstrate some of the new tools and technologies that we've been applying. The idea behind this was to try to use this as one of the case study houses. Architects and others may be familiar with the case study program that ran from 1945 to 1966, mainly in Southern California, where architects and builders and the public I think there were something like 36 houses that were designed, or some weren't built, some were demolished. But our idea was to try to use this as maybe case study house number 37 and sort of update that whole idea. And so this is a great town and gown partnership with Historic Hawaii Foundation. I want to thank Kirsten for supporting this. It's really embedded within the University of Hawaii. And part of this is linked to the work that I do as the director of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, which is a FEMA funded organization that focuses on natural hazards, but also response and recovery from various types of disasters. A big part of what we do is look at various types of technologies, new technologies for reducing risk, improving detection, alert, and warning systems, but also work in hazard mitigation. As you all know, that this past year was really record-setting in terms of many disasters. Actually, even this year has seen a lot of disasters as well. So I don't know if any of you were awakened last night by the tsunami threat at 3 a.m. Fortunately, I don't think there was much damage, but disasters are growing in part because of the climate stressors and many of the other challenges that I think we face. And so what we wanted to do was to take some of the ideas about building more resilient communities and then apply them to this house or this structure. And what we wanted was in-person meetings and to run a design charrette, to have close face-to-face engagement. Well, because of the pandemic, what we got was more Zoom meetings. But what we tried to do was to apply some technology, some of which I'll be showing, and I can also give you more information about that and how we can use these different sorts of technologies to still engage the community and professionals in thinking about resilient design. The overview actually kind of mirrors the steps that Jen and Jennifer laid out, in that we are focusing on a risk and vulnerability assessment, looking very closely at the site, mapping the hazards, looking at different strategies, and then working closely with many subject matter experts that we brought together. We're sort of in the process of developing and disseminating the plan and actions. And there's a big focus on historic preservation. And when we think about historic preservation, it's important to think both about the structure, but also the person associated with the structure. And for those of you who are not familiar, Jean Charlot was one of the leading Hawaii artists that we have. I think he's done more than 70 murals, public murals across the world. And he was a faculty member at the University of Hawaii. There are several of his murals on campus. Actually, when I was vice chancellor, one of the murals was right around my office. And I actually worked on the donation of the house to the University of Hawaii, because again, it was a very, very special person connected with the University of Hawaii as an artist, designer, and educator. The house is also very special. It was designed by one of Hawaii's foremost architects, Pete Wimberly. The landscape architect was James Hubbard. It was built in 1958. It's on the National and State Register of Historic Places. It's an interesting modern house, two-story split level ranch. And it actually captures the sort of indoor-outdoor feeling of Hawaii, with 3 lanais and And one of the neat features is this table that kind of extends from the inside to the outside of the house. I don't know if you can indicate if you've seen this house in the chat or if you've been to it. That might be helpful. But there is a 12 by 12 mural. I think it's called Tropical Foliage. And I think if you look at the brick floors, the concrete floors, there are some opportunities for applying many of the treatments that Jen and Jenny described earlier. Here's a video. One of the things that we've been doing is using the same cameras that Google Street View uses to capture the interiors of spaces. And in the absence of being actually able to travel or go there face to face in person, you can see what the house looks like, its present condition, and then the opportunities for various types of treatments or mitigations associated with the house. It's located in a hazardous location. It's next to a canal, also next to the Waialae Country Club golf course. And so the greatest threat is related to flooding. And if you examine the firms, it is in a special flood hazard risk zone. And this image was actually generated by one of our graduate students who ran the HECRAS model. And you can see that there are two seasonal streams that feed the canal. And so there's really a high risk of potential flooding when there are high rain events. As I mentioned before, it is located within the special flood hazard zone, and if you were, you would be required to get flood insurance for this house because of its location right on the edge of the canal. It's in both the AE, but also very close to the VE flood zones. And I want to point out that the 100-year flood is a 1% chance of a flood occurring in any given year. But if you think about this over the next 30 years, which would be the time of a typical mortgage, the risk is actually much greater. It's a 26% chance. And then if you add into that the hazards associated with sea level rise and more extreme events occurring, tsunamis, the risk is actually underestimated. And again, in December of last year, there was a high rain event, which you can see how high the water levels got. Again, this video was taken by one of our graduate students who's been working on this project. Somehow get off. So part of the work that we've been doing has been looking at the different sorts of threats and hazards associated with flooding, mapping the elevations, considering the estimated elevations, and then also looking at the effects of storm surge. And this shows different levels of storm surge that could be occurring. and then also taking that event that occurred and the flooding in December 2021, and then mapping the potential impacts as a baseline condition. And so part of the work that we're doing is to try to apply different types of treatments to address the flood risk. And I think the NPS guidelines give lots of good suggestions in addition to the temporary walls and flood barriers. We've been exploring the potential use of different bladders as well as other types of actions that could be taken to help reduce the flood risk. One of the challenges, of course, is that with a hurricane and other big wind event, there's a possibility of roof damage, which could then lead to heavy rainfall that enters into the structure. We're also obviously concerned about the potential for structural damage that could occur to the home if there was a high wind event. And so part of the important work involves ensuring that there's a continuous load path where the roof is connected to the wall and the wall is connected to the floor and foundation. And there are also various types of fasteners or hurricane clips, other types of modifications that can be made to strengthen the building, structural screws to complete the load path.
Excuse me, Dr. Kim. I'm so
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. We're looking at your presentation mode, not your presentation. We're looking at your, so if you're able to switch it, please do. And then if you can't, don't worry about it.
Oh,
So we're looking at your,
I don't know what happened.
okay. There's a little thing on the top left of your Zoom menu bar where I think you can, I'm not sure if you're on a Mac. If not, please proceed. I don't.
Yeah, I think I'll just proceed because I know we're sort of out of time.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and so part of this has been work that's been done by Sea Grant and in particular Dennis Huang, who's helped with this homeowner's handbook for natural hazards. And some of these are more or less appropriate for a historic structure. And so I do think that there are some challenges that are associated with preserving and protecting the architectural features and thinking about the multiple hazards and threats that we face at this site location. So in addition to the flooding and rainfall, lightning, possibility of debris impacts as well too. And so clearly a big part of this involves the management of uncertainty in dealing with climate change and extreme events, but also urbanization of the area, which would increase the amount of impervious surface space. And another challenge that we face is the many sorts of disciplinary biases and stovepipes that occur. And so part of what this project is about is how to bring different disciplinary approaches together and continue learning and engagement with a strong emphasis on place-based planning, design, and preservation. And part of what we're trying to do is to use this as a case study house to better understand phenomena, but also actions such as insurance, flood insurance, hurricane insurance, catastrophe insurance. And I think that there are some important challenges that we face in terms of social and environmental justice and using this as a teaching learning resource is part of the plan that that we're engaged in. And so if you have any questions or comments, I thought we would maybe turn to some discussion right now. And I thought maybe there were 3 questions that might be useful to discuss. And the first is, are we missing something here? And then second, what do you all think about using this as a case study house? And can we better apply the NPS guidelines and other tools for risk and vulnerability assessment and site analysis and other types of strategies? So with that, maybe I will stop screen sharing and hopefully we can have some discussion here.
Thank you, Dr. Kim and Jennifer Eggleston and Jenny Parker. It's fascinating to see all of this come together, from both the big picture down to how we apply this to a specific place and a specific site. Historic Hawaii Foundation's been involved in numerous Section 106 consultations and planning frameworks, and trying to look at both resiliency to prevent some of these disasters from affecting historic and cultural resources, but also the recovery from them. So I really appreciate all of you sharing your knowledge and your insights into this topic that has been so top of mind for all of us here in Hawaii and really across the country. We've been getting a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I do want to spend a little bit of time on that. So, a lot of them are sort of about trade-offs, as the storm is bearing down, as the hurricane warning has come, as the flood waters are rising, are there immediate things that should be done? Are there things that you can plan for in advance? You don't always want to just nail plywood over the windows, So maybe Jenny and Jen, can you talk a little bit about the emergency reaction? As the storm is coming, are there things that we could do better to prepare or to be ready for that?
Not sure which of us is taking that, but I'll first stab. So the guidelines were really intended to be much ahead of any sort of emergency declaration or an immediate threat coming. So yes, the whole point of the adaptations that we discuss are to take the pressure off of that immediate emergency environment. So it will all be highly dependent on the characteristics of the site and what kind of manpower you have to determine whether or not an appropriate solution is more of a temporary kind of treatment that requires people on site to put in floodgates at all of your doorways, or maybe it's the type of site that's not feasible to require human intervention when a flood is coming. Maybe you need to really focus in on some of the more permanent adaptations that don't require someone to be on site. So maybe then you are looking at dry flood proofing or elevating the structure. So it's also dependent on the specific site and the management of that site. Who is the owner, who's involved in managing? Jen, did you want to add something to that?
I know, it's probably not the perfect answer, because it is what if I didn't adapt and now the disaster coming, but that is the emphasis of the document, is to say, get to the mitigation before you need some serious intervention. And obviously there's the response and recovery piece of a disaster. And again, a lot of our work came out of a Hurricane Katrina program, which was a huge recovery effort, and understanding what kinds of information even needed to be in property owners' hands. So we had a good, lively chat about materials resiliency. That was a big one, right? Like getting people the right type of understanding materials, cleaning materials, to say you don't have to tear it all out. There's a resiliency here that sometimes folks just aren't aware of. You're looking at your entire life destroyed. You're not necessarily going, well, let me be very careful with my plaster wall. So a lot of education and preload is kind of what this document is supposed to do, recognizing, again, when we get into a response recovery action, we're going to have to move in a different posture and often make kind of more tough decisions, draconian decisions at times to be able to get that property back online and help those property owners go through a huge tragedy. So
thank you for that. Another set of questions really has to do with sort of the pros and cons or the benefits and risks associated with specific treatment options. And when you're weighing, and I think you did a great job of explaining the different factors and questions to ask and how to analyze that. But weighing the trade-offs has come up a couple of times. So, for example, on a broad neighborhood shoreline scale, it's really not recommended to do hardening of the shoreline. You know, that has a ripple effect. It has an effect, you know, off-site as well. And so you might be protecting the particular property, but causing a problem elsewhere. So I know that was just one of many of the strategies and one of the things that might be considered, but given the effect off-site, is hardening the shoreline actually a viable treatment?
So, and I appreciate that comment, because again, even when we put the recommendations together, we aren't saying these are what you should do. What we're saying is these are things people are doing. And so some of the again, we weren't saying you should go elevate your building. What we're saying is there's an elevation. There's a reason to elevate. There's a pot of money to elevate. Here's what you have to think about when you're elevating. Similarly with the hardening, the over-engineering of a solution, fully recognize that this is not something we're saying this is what a community should do. What we were trying to acknowledge is this is what a community does. So what are some of the things that we have to think about as preservationists if we're presented with this kind of a solution? And it's not necessarily one we want, but it might be the one we have. And, you know, levying was the one I called out. Levies are extremely political. They're a hardening generally, and they're not necessarily going to go away in parts of the country. And so that was some of those thinking pieces that we went through when we put the document together. And I don't know, Jenny, if you want to pile on there at all.
No, I think, you know, situations are different in different parts of the country, both politically and just with the situation on the ground that you're dealing with. So, you know, while we personally prefer to see some of these more innovative treatments, bringing back natural systems, really thinking very thoughtfully and long-term in a broad landscape scale, you know, we don't control the narrative by any means. So again, we do want to provide the tools so that people understand the impact from a preservation perspective of all of these options that are out there that people might be exploring.
I wanted to add to that, flooding is best managed and treated from a regional or watershed perspective, that there are really limits to how much you can do with an individual site or parcel of land. And so part of this is trying to look at the collective solutions that that could impact the area as well too. I think the other challenge that exists with this is that, you know, the notion of boundaries and sort of looking at not just the property boundaries, but the natural boundaries that exist, and how we incorporate an understanding, appreciation of the landscape and some of the changes that have occurred over time, but will continue to occur because of these extreme events, these flooding events. And I also think that does bring raise the possibility of some sort of collective actions with not just the adjacent properties, but also the entire watershed.
We've got a couple of questions looking at, I'll call it two ends of the spectrum. One of embracing more of the natural solutions, the offsite kind of restoring wetlands or having more of that natural resiliency built in. And then the other end of the spectrum is innovative technologies and materials. There was some interest in this hydraulic lift idea or these buoyancy foundations. Can you talk, any of you, I'm throwing this out to all of you, what are some of the state-of-the-art solutions, whether that's going back to nature or making engineering work for us? Are you seeing some success stories, or is it the jury's still out? What are you seeing in the field?
I'll start on a slightly side angle of that, and others please feel free to jump in. One of the things that we're doing with our materials testing, which is a whole other topic, its own presentation, is the idea of actually trying to go back and look at traditional materials, traditional ways in which people have lived with water and thought about water and addressed water. And so it's always interesting when you're in this space where it's like innovation is actually just looking at what we have on site, how we've addressed this through time. And so that's something that to us, at least in some of the spaces we've gotten involved in, it's kind of both kind of channeling together in some ways and saying, well, how do we look at this material or this traditional process and then try to, which is what our testing was doing, like try to assign the framework that the regular industry uses to it so that we can start to kind of share in that space and understand how to use it and apply it and be accepted by the systems that we work in. So that's a piece that we are kind of tackling.
I know that the university is working on different types of materials, testing materials in terms of how absorbent they are, but also the idea of rather than trying to import materials, if you can utilize locally available materials, plants, and other types of locally sourced products that can be used in these treatments. And so again, the emphasis is upon trying to design and test and evaluate these new innovations.
And I'll address a little bit the buoyant foundations and the hydraulic lifts. The buoyant foundations, there's actually a lot of information out there, particularly for new construction related to that strategy. We have seen some test cases in Louisiana following Katrina of applying the adaptation to a shotgun style house that you saw in the graphic on the screen. And it looks really promising. We still have a lot of questions about that particular treatment as you get into more complex building forms, asymmetrical kind of design. How does that balance out? What are the technical issues involved, and how much do you have to really add into your foundation to make that balance work? So there's still, I think, a lot of retrofit questions. Again, you can look at a lot of new construction, sort of floating house idea that works really well. So I think there's probably a lot of growth potential in that area to learn more and see what that means in terms of retrofitting historic properties, historic buildings. The hydraulic lifts, as far as I know, is an idea that has not been implemented for flooding. The National Trust is kind of the well-known thought leaders on that particular idea. It's something they've been looking at for the Farnsworth House in Pennsylvania. My understanding is that due to cost, it has not been implemented. And I'm not sure where they are on that particular project on actually selecting an adaptation to implement. But it is a really fascinating idea that on paper looks like it would probably work, but has not actually been done yet, as far as I know.
Yeah, I think clearly this is a evolving area of design and construction. As more and more people start looking at these options, we'll get better data, be able to share out, what works and what doesn't. A lot of these treatment options obviously rely on the design and construction of the resource that you're talking about. If you're talking about elevation or relocation, a slab on grade building like the Charlot House is probably not going to be possible. It cannot physically be moved the way a plantation era, wooden building on pier and post can be. So we've been getting some questions about relocation, elevation. Clearly that either separates a resource from its site or changes its character in really dramatic ways. I know as a preservationist, my heart just stops when we even talk about it. So can we maybe explore that idea? What are some of those trade-offs? And I'm thinking it's sort of a last resort, like the Alaska Church example that you showed.
And Jenny, feel free to, well, obviously we can all pile in here. Moving, elevating, and then the very dreaded demolition are the three things that have funding called hazard mitigation funding available to them. So they're treatments that you're going to see pretty regularly, especially as a disaster situation amps up or flooding intensifies. Like what you just said, when I first kind of stumbled into this world, it was like, oh my gosh, moving, elevating, demoing, oh my, kind of thing. Like none of these are good. How do we start to think about the fact this is where the money is and this is where people are often going? Part of that really was to try to say there's a whole suite here. Let's not jump there, right? But so slab on grade, and Jenny, this one you can definitely pile in here. Not easy to do it, but it is doable. And this is what we saw in Houston, right? Post Harvey, those are mostly slab on grade construction that ultimately became elevated. So it's possible. All things are possible with money, right? All things are possible with money. And the amount of real estate value and pressure that was happening to say, I've got to get up past where I am. But the idea of the connectivity to a site, look at the case study house and how important nature is and its location is. And it's not just a piece of architecture, right? It's a piece of architecture living inside of that environment, are all things that we talk about. Elevation being the longest section in the entire adaptation standards for a reason, to walk people through. There is so much you have to think about beyond foundation treatment and how high am I going. There are all these interconnected concepts that are so key in thinking through this. Jenny, I don't know if you want to like jump in there, especially on any of the elevation piece, because Jenny gets to present that one the most, so probably has the most thoughts about it at times.
I mean, I will say, and I see a comment coming through in the chat that, you know, sad to see preservationists against lifting and moving. And, you know, we are, because the buildings are connected to a place, and we come from the stance that place matters. However, you know, what we are trying to do with the guidelines is create space for that. We recognize that flooding in a lot of situations is an existential crisis for these properties. So when you get to that point, we would much rather see, you know, as much of the resource lifted out of the threat, moved away from the threat, so that you save at least part of it and don't lose it in its entirety, rather than leaving it in place and clinging to, you know, this connection that isn't sustainable for the future. So I would say that where we're trying to be is a balance between the two. We would like to see projects really go through that planning process that Jen and I spent so much time walking through, because it is so highly dependent on the specific location and site. You know, I think at one point Jen said what's appropriate in one location and will have a minimal impact in terms of preserving what's left. At one site, you do the exact same thing at the neighbor, and all of a sudden you have a huge impact that really changes everything. So I know people hate it when preservation say it depends. We don't like giving that answer, but unfortunately that's where we are. And we hope that the planning process can help property owners really think through that process and arrive at, if not something that everyone is happy about, at least something everyone understands why they chose the adaptation they did, and that it's based on some sort of logic and analysis of the specific site conditions. So I wouldn't say we're anti-relocating or anti-elevating. We are not. It is absolutely appropriate in certain circumstances. And in the guidelines, you'll see examples that we highlight as really good implementations of both of those treatments.
Thank you for that. My big takeaway from the last hour and a half of discussion has been, it's really about the methodology. It's having a system to do the data gathering, the research, the analysis, and the big takeaway of make a decision. Don't just get stuck in paralysis, but make a decision, move forward. But there's not a one size fits all, but this truly is about site-specific analysis and decision making. With that, we really are at the end of our time today. I want to thank all of you. It's been fantastic to just get this insight and this information. For our audience, we will be posting both the recording and the presentation slides. So we'll have those available at historichawaii.org. I want to thank our partners in all of this, National Park Service, as well as the University of Hawaii, through various departments for both entities. We really appreciate all of the partnerships that we have with you. There will be a post-event survey that pops up after you log out of the Zoom. There will be a separate website that pops up and asks you to give us some feedback. For AIA members who need continuing education credits, you'll need to enter your name, your email, and your AIA number. AICP, it's self-reported. You just go to the AICP website and enter it. And if in that survey, if there are other topics, technical preservation topics, or even follow-up from today that you would find useful, please let us know. We're planning a whole series both for the rest of this year and into the future. So if there are topics that would be useful for you, let us know what those are. So with that, I just want to thank you all for supporting Historic Hawaii Foundation. Thank you for coming and spending the couple of hours with us, and mahalo nui.